Thank you for being here. I would like to also dedicate this evening to our good friend and very admiring friend, Jonas Makers, who just passed away last Wednesday. And he did manage to pass on the baton to me and our team members that we will continue to do the work with our capital campaign to build the library on top that we named Heaven on Earth after Harry Smith. And then we'll create also a restaurant on the side and perhaps an art gallery in the basement. And we'll keep you updated. It's in those parts, the capital campaign has been going very well. So this evening is dedicated to them. I just came back from LA, spent some time with the artist named Lauren Barnes at Metabolic Studio. So they printed out a nice drawing of Jonas and also the handkerchief, the second one, that say, for an artist to be normal is a disaster. So I really appreciate Jonas of all that he did for experimental film and beyond. I would say that there are so many things I can speak for everyone on our behalf, but one that came to my mind immediately was the fact that John Keats' term, negative capability, is the capability to be at ease or at risk in uncertainties, in mystery, and that without the need for reaching for any facts or reasons. And I always love that, partly because that's what artists do. They have this incredible capability to live with great uncertainty, which separates them from business people or politicians. And secondly, I always felt of all the magazines that I have collected over the years and studied and read, Seven Arts magazine, which was created from 1960 to 17, it's only 1 year that it existed, but it had incredible significant influence on the magazine that came after, including Marxist Quarterly, that turned into eventually Partisan Review, and then Tiger's Eye and View magazine. I mean, endless magazine periodical came from that very magazine. So I admire that very much. The rail was very much inspired after the October Revolution, particularly the film by Sergei Eisenstein, which was made after, as you remember, John Reed, 10 Days That Shook the World, that marvelous book that somehow was translated by a friend of my uncle into Vietnamese. So I read in Vietnamese, and then came over in the year that there was a movie made of that terrific book, directed and acted by Warren Beatty. It's called Red, 1981. You remember? Yeah. So the Rail is really a paper that embraces the seven arts together. And it's politically speaking, very much intending and firmly committing to the idea of keeping it free to the public. Because it's not a specialized paper whatsoever. It's not, for example, like a talk magazine or Art Forum or other magazines. It's a magazine that embraces all the disciplines that allow all of it. And eventually, it's really a magazine that really about not so much the voice of the artist, but the expression of the artist for the community. And I always love the idea of keep it free. So it is October when it was created in 2000. And it's October for the people. That was our intention, and it will continue to be that way. And lastly, which is be hard to describe where we go from here. But one thing I can say is that I can blame Jack Flam, my dear friend Jack Flam, because we learn to mobilize things, activities very quickly when we collaborate with the Sandy Show. Come Together, Surviving Sandy. That was 2013. In fact, in this very building, it was 100,000 square feet. And we did it less than 2.5 months. And Jack and I worked together so fluidly because within the context of the show being shown, especially to the children in this neighborhood who came over and felt at home, that was very important to us, to Jack. In fact, it was so important to Dedalus Foundation that Jack and the Board of Trustees changed the course of their philanthropic giving. From instead of giving, funding away to non-profit and so on, now they are focusing on giving art lessons, hiring other people to teach children from kindergarten to high school, even with fellowship.
Adults also.
And adults also, if they would like to join and come. So everything came together in that experience when we did the show, because we had dance performances, we commissioned poetry reading, we did film screening, panel discussion, endless events, which we do today. So with that note, I would like to introduce briefly, because I'm dying to know what each of our luminous panelists would have to say. I can't imagine that Christa, who is the CEO and director of the Joan Mitchell Foundation, I can't imagine Joan Mitchell without jazz. I can't imagine Joan Mitchell without dance when she started out. I can't imagine her reading of Proust's French literature and everyone else on that order. I can't imagine Robert Motherwell without Mallarmé, poetry, Paul Valéry. Can't imagine Mozart, and can't imagine him without philosophy, his deep interest in philosophy. I can't imagine Albert Gottlieb without his political interest. Early on, archaeology, history, John Greek, see? Exactly. And I can't imagine Mark Suvero without his love for Greek poetry, civilization, and above all, also, Eastern philosophy. He spent some years in Shanghai, there, come back and forth, and he certainly have a very strong feeling against the war in Vietnam, where I came from. So it was an easy bond. And Mark Rosenthal, who I knew when I was a student in Philadelphia in the 80s, because he curated so many remarkable shows there, including the first retrospective of Kiefer. I still remember that show very well. And then we re-met later at Kippy, where we would go for the summer, Kippy camp, without any other lingering here. Is it okay, adequate, Mark? Thank you for being here. Please, welcome.
I don't know, do we need this?
Yes.
Yes. Sure. And hold it close, please.
Okay. Fong asked me to edit a section of the rail, and at first I was thinking about a subject within art and art history and what I do in life. But somehow or other, I don't know what triggered it, but I started thinking about the possibility of devoting the section to artist-endowed foundations, which lately I've said is the great emerging platform, to use a computer-type term, in the art world. And I say that because of the position that foundations have taken, the power that they have, the tremendous power for good that foundations have been assuming has really been impressive to me. having made that decision, I started thinking about my own experience with artist foundations, and I realized how ignorant I was. One's always ignorant about things one hasn't spent too much time thinking about. I was familiar with the Rothko Foundation back in the day and the nefarious acts of that organization. I was talking tonight to someone about remembering what happened when the Warhol got started. So I was aware of various things relating to foundations, but this experience has given me an enormously rewarding chance to think about what artist foundations are about. And my great discovery, and this is just me being naive, is that it has so much more to do with the person who runs the foundation, or as much as with that person as the name on the door. The name on the door being the artist who started the foundation. Because we called the section Artists Extending Their Reach, and for the most part it's extending their reach obviously after their death. But their reach is extended by the directors of these foundations. And what I started to realize about these directors was all the skills they had. There's the obvious administrative skills that are called for, but there's a degree of art historical perspective that's necessary in order to chaperone the artist's career into the future. And then finally, there's the whole idea of the vision of the foundation as it goes on, and how that's created by these directors. And so I've come to have just enormous respect for you people and all the other people who've done this work, not only for the philanthropic dimensions, but the most simple part of what they do. Sometimes a director of a foundation is working with an artist with a very modest reputation. And in many cases, they succeed, these directors, in enhancing the artist's reputation way beyond what it was in their lifetime. So that is an aspect of the job. So the job is very complicated, and I'm asking each person to spend a couple of minutes describing who they are, what they were doing before they became head of the foundation, and how their experience before they came to their current position has helped them. So I'll start with Christa.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to see everybody here tonight too. I also want to thank everybody for making it out. So when Mark posed this question to me, I called him and said, "Do you want me to talk about the foundation?" And he was like, "No, about you." And the reason I say this is because I started out as an artist, practicing artist, and in my 20s and 30s, I spent a lot of time working for nonprofits as a way of making ends meet while also having studio practice. And for me, that was a great learning ground. I was very interested in working for nonprofits that were artist-centered. I was very clear about that. And I ended up working at the New York Foundation for the Arts, and then I came into Joan Mitchell actually on the programmatic side. And came in at a point where the foundation was growing immensely, and worked to a point where I actually ended up being in the role of deputy director. And then made the decision to leave, wanted to refocus on my own practice. I had a second child, that sort of thing, and just anticipated moving on with my life. And the board called me about a year after that and said that my predecessor, Carolyn, who had been the founding director, had decided to step down, and would I consider coming in and having a conversation with them as they did this application, as they did a search. And I realized that I actually had a lot of opinions about what it meant, both coming from being an artist myself, but also having worked with the foundation about our strength as a foundation, but also about our sort of greater potential strength. And so I came back in and I think it's clear that everybody know that I don't come in from the scholar side, actually. For me, it is very centered in being an artist, but it is also very centered in thinking about organizational health. That is a lot of what I've done, and I think some of it is as somebody who's coming in after a founder. That's a lot of the work that's regularly happens, and for me, it's been about thinking what is thinking with the board. What do we want long term? Are we perpetuity, non-perpetuity? Those types of things. And so I see my role as very much about ensuring the health of our organization in order to steward Mitchell's legacy. Obviously, I have the opportunity to learn a lot about Mitchell along the way, but for me, it is about ensuring we have the team and the sort of mechanism in place.
Thank you. So funny, I didn't realize that 7 Arts only lasted for a year. Closer like that? I didn't realize 7 Arts only lasted for a year because it's such an influential magazine on me when I was a student. Anyway, so I started out as a painter and then as an art historian and then as a professor, which is, I think, a fairly common trajectory for a lot of people of my generation. And I got to know Robert Motherwell kind of through a fluke. He reviewed a book that I'd written or edited, Matisse on Art, along with catalog for the Matisse Cutout Show that I co-curated at the National Gallery for the New York Times Book Review. And a friend of mine who was Helen Frankenthaler's nephew, Clifford Ross, who many of you know, had said to me, it would be nice if you met Motherwell. And Motherwell had been a kind of hero of mine when I was a young art student. And I thought, I'd like to meet Motherwell. And Clifford said, he'd like to meet you too. So I went out to Greenwich and met him, and we hit it off very well. And we started working on a number of projects together. I realized after a while, one of the reasons he wanted to meet me is he liked my Matisse on Art book a lot, and he wanted to pass on the Documents of 20th Century Art series, which he had started back in 1944. And he figured I would be the guy to do it. So it was kind of a setup. I didn't realize it until afterwards. And I'm still editing the series now. And we worked very closely together on a number of projects, on documents, books, exhibitions, etc. And over the years, I got to know a lot about how he thought about things. We discussed a lot about what he wanted to have with his foundation after he died. He put me on his foundation board in his lifetime. And he also gave me functions in his will having to do with his legacy. So it was almost independent of the foundation. So when I became the director, the president of the foundation, I'd already been a vice president for around 10 years. I was kind of the most active board member. The first president was a financial guy. He was Motherwell's financial advisor. And he helped us go through our birth pangs, which are for any foundation, even if it's fairly well conceived, considerable. He also taught me a lot about finance because he had to teach me a lot because I knew nothing. I was a typical college professor. I thought money just sort of came from the sky, like mama. So, not for myself, but in the world at large. And so, when I took over the foundation, our biggest project was a catalog raisonné. I knew Motherwell wanted a catalog raisonné. He had expected that I would work on the catalog raisonné, but I did not have any interest in working on the catalog raisonné. Although eventually I ended up directing the catalog raisonné project. So there were all sorts of subtle things that happened, but after we finished the catalog raisonné, I decided, talking to my colleagues, that I think we should move on to something else. And what we wanted to do was to make people's lives better through art. It sounds corny, but it's a very real thing. And I have to say, over the last basically 8 years or so, that we changed our focus toward education and toward more hands-on projects rather than just giving money to museums, et cetera. We've been able to really change people's lives for the better through art.
I can try to use two at once. So, like my friends up here, I started out as an artist. I'm still an artist. I keep batting away at it. I also, before I was at the Gottlieb Foundation, I was going to Hunter College at night and picking up whatever work I could during the day. And those day jobs morphed strangely. I got a job with the Sonnabend Gallery, which was then on Madison Avenue and 68th Street, if I remember correctly. And went from there to the Janus Gallery. I'm sorry, is that better?
Yes.
So I went from there to the Janus Gallery, where I stayed for about 3 years. And I think between formal education at Hunter and what I was learning at Janus about the art gallery world, the artist's life, I also, same time, was involved with 98 Green Street Loft. If any of you remember that, it was a very early alternative space. So my days were basically 24 hours long, but totally immersed in making art, being in an artist's world, being in the art world in some way. Janus at the time was one of the biggest galleries in the world. It was a staff of 6 people, 3 of them were Januses. So for the 3 of us who weren't Januses, we had a lot of work to do. And we did, and we learned a lot. I certainly learned a lot about how an organization like that works, about how museums work, about what curators do, about how one organizes an exhibition, about how one organizes things internationally. I remember working on the first Basel Art Fair with the Janus Gallery. I remember meeting a young curator named Anne Darnencourt who was working on a Duchamp show and helping a little bit with that. And so all of those skills and sort of knowing an artist's life, I think were wonderful preparation for what I never planned to do but ended up doing, which is running the Gottlieb Foundation. And I guess you didn't want to talk about the foundation, so I won't. I guess that in brief is what my background was prior to running the foundation.
So when I met Mark Suvero, I had no idea who he was. I met him in 1986 through a friend. I had been out of colleges for a couple of years and met him that way, and then heard a few months later that they were looking for someone to help them in their office. He had just started Socrates Sculpture Park that opened in September 1986, and I started working for him in February 1987. He started Socrates with his nephew, Enrico Martignoni, who really did all the initial legwork of making the application to the city. So he had a working studio, he had the park that had just started, they had no money, and they had no one working there really, except for Enrico. So I got there and they handed me about a 2-foot tall pile of papers from workers' comp with cancellation notices and said, please, can you sort this out? And that's how I started working for him, basically doing administration and sorting things out for him. My background, I was a philosophy major. Actually, Mark was a philosophy major, and his nephew Enrico was a philosophy major in college, so maybe that was a connection. He is someone who, so basically, the majority of my working life has been working for Mark and running us now for the last probably 18 years running the studio. Before I was really mostly just doing all the finances. And also worked for Socrates and worked for the Athena Foundation, which was his first foundation. And also he had a foundation in France, and he's starting another one now. So my experience with him is mostly keeping all the balls up in the air, hopefully not falling down. And I think that, let's see, what I bring to that is Mark and I have worked together for a long time, and we have an affinity. You know, I think some of that's just time, it's personality. My father was an immigrant to this country. That's Mark's background. My grandfather was an artist. I have a sense of what it is. I grew up in an environment where people made art. Not immediately around me, but my family, people made art. So I think that he always felt that I understood what he was trying to do and who he was. And we have gone through many phases of different types of organizations, some of which still continue and some which don't. His friend's foundation doesn't exist anymore. So it's just been an ongoing partnership that continues to evolve because we're a little bit outliers in this group because he has a foundation that's been very active, which is Socrates Sculpture Park for 30 years, over 30 years now, and has served thousands of artists, like 1,200 artists and thousands of school children every year. But he's always trying to do something new, and none of those components had anything to do with his own legacy, which is not something he likes to think about, but is something that, of course, we are trying to grapple with now about what happens to all this stuff.
So I'd love to hear from each of you, what is the single unique challenge that you face on a daily basis, that you see as what should be motivating you every day?
I get to start again. I love your description of how the sort of model continues to change and evolve, and I think that's something that we have thought a lot about as a foundation. So, as I said, I stepped in and I sort of have the opportunity of being the second generation head of an artist-endowed foundation. And when I started in 2015, we had a really, really important, serious conversation about the question of perpetuity. And I always feel like perpetuity is sort of like shooting at the moon in some manner. It's like, what does it actually mean? But I think what became very clear to us is that the Joan Mitchell Foundation has a real deep and significant history of supporting artists directly. Mitchell was really clear in her will about she wanted the resources to be used to support artists directly, and that we were really aware that we had an opportunity and an obligation to think about the foundation in such a way that it could continue to do its work indefinitely. And so with that, we made some very significant decisions around our operating size. So that's something that continues to sort of come through for us. It's just the question of like how you do everything you want to do while also thinking about the future. So the short term and the long term is something that is constantly a struggle. I think especially if we have a board that is comprised very much of artists. And so there's always this feeling of like, we'd like to do more, and trying to figure out how to effectively do what we need to do. And then the other side of it being, my real focus has been about thinking, so we have done this work directly with artists for years, very, very strongly and well. And what does it mean to also, what is our obligation? And obligation is not even the right word. It's what is our opportunity for Mitchell, and what does deepening the legacy stewardship work around Mitchell mean to us now in this phase? And that's included thinking about a catalog raisonné. We've started one. We've really sort of deepened our resources in terms of making sure the archives are available to scholars. We've hired a conservator to do work to really understand Mitchell's paintings. Those types of things we've been doing a lot more on. And something that I have personally been thinking a lot about is, so for us in our model, this isn't true for every artist-endowed foundation, but for us in our model, Mitchell was clear that we sell and place the collection ultimately. So this is 30 years, 40 years down the road. Once we don't have a collection anymore, what does it mean for us to be an artist-endowed foundation? And how do we get from here to there in ways that both benefit her wishes towards artists, but also ensure that we are effectively doing our work for Mitchell? And it's just that to me is the sort of point right now I'm trying to think through is like how to aim for that end point. And it's not gonna be the end point, it's gonna be the start point for another phase of the foundation, but how to aim to that point in the right way.
So I think our unique challenge is to keep evolving in a meaningful way in the various domains that we've chosen to work in and that we feel continue the legacy of Ronald Motherwell. One of them has to do with Motherwell legacy. That is to say, exhibitions of his work, placing his work, etc. In recent years, we've developed pretty elaborate education programs, many of which happen right across the hall here, right in the next building, right across the hall here. And those have been evolving quite a lot. And one of our challenges has been who we work with, because we're working with a public. Right now, it's a public largely from this neighborhood, although there are people from throughout the city that are parts of our programs. But also, we've had partnerships, and partnerships change because we're in a very volatile society, especially for people who are in the lower socioeconomic rungs of society. And our focus has been largely on people who are not very well economically advantaged. In other words, we're really trying to work a lot with bringing art and having it enrich the lives of people who might not have had access to art otherwise. And one of the stories I want to tell just very briefly is we were working with a group named Turning Point. Unfortunately, they are no longer really viable anymore, but they were for a while a really terrific partner. And in one of our classes, the teachers, and this is something else that we do, we'd like to hire artist teachers to teach our classes, so we're also supporting people in the community of artists, even though we don't give grants directly. That's something Motherwell was not interested in. Anyway, in the class, there's a woman in her 30s, and Turning Point is mostly people who are ex-drug addicts, battered women, former prisoners. That was the main part of their population. At Turning Point, they were turning point in their lives. So anyway, the teacher's teaching in class, and there's a woman around 35 in the class, and they're doing collages, and she begins to weep. And the teacher gets very upset because this woman having a nervous breakdown. What's happening? The teacher goes over to her and says, "Are you okay?" And the woman can't stop sobbing. And she says to her, "What can I do?" And she said, no, everything's okay. It's just, this is the first time in my life anybody ever asked me to express myself about anything. And that, to us, became a real energizer. That's what really focuses on this idea of that you can make people's lives better through art. And this is something that was very dear to Motherwell, who was a pioneer in teaching art as a form of self-realization. So we feel that we're both fulfilling our commitment to the artist and also doing something in society that's worthwhile.
That's great, thank you. So we have a few different purposes. We have 2 grant programs for individual artists. I think most of you are aware of. One is an annual competition where we take applications from people all over the world and have panels make decisions on which artists will apply that year will receive grants. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about how we can continue to refine that, keep it open, and find new ways to get the word out. A challenge, since now is the time of year when we're getting the reviews. A big challenge has been finding people to sit on those panels because so many artists now are so busy, so much busier than they used to be. That's been an interesting thing that develops, gaining momentum. The other program we have is for people who suffer catastrophic emergencies. And they are we hear from people virtually every day from all over the world, through their experience or other, trying to keep a sense of balance personally, and trying to keep staff who deals with this from not getting emotionally strong or lost in some of these situations is a constant challenge for us. Trying to work through individual situations, deal with these one at a time. Trying to work through each situation, understand what it is, and try to understand how we might try to mitigate it, and always need that. But we do make an effort every time to understand what's going on. That's a daily issue with us. We also have what we call exhibition. We use collection we have to organize exhibitions. And when we do that, we try to get those exhibitions to communities that ordinarily have a chance to see an exhibition of value for so much of the next generation. And we'll try to set up tours that we go to some of the larger museums in the country, but also some of the small remote places in this country. And keep a fee structure up there so that it's affordable for everyone, so we can reach different audiences. And similar to what Jack said about educating people, bringing people in, we're doing it slightly different. We're using AL's arts as the mechanism to do that. But we're last year did a show that opened in Chattanooga, Tennessee, went to Akron, Ohio, went to Fort Wayne, Indiana. Not places you would ordinarily finding exhibitions. So those are among the things that we deal with every day.
So for Socrates, the issue, Mark is 85, and Socrates has been incredibly well supported by people who support Mark for a long time. It's a public charity. It's very successful, has a great track record, but we work very hard to make sure that Socrates is an entity that would be able to continue after Mark dies, and that it will continue to have support and strength. And he obviously is even though he's never really been directly involved with it in the way that many people have thought he was. He never selected the artists in the show, but he is the spirit of the place. And we, for Socrates, always are concerned about how will the place continue and how will it be able to thrive on its own after him. And Socrates has been incredibly lucky in its history and has had a great series of directors who have done an amazing job up till John Hatfield, who's the director now, who's just doing an absolutely spectacular job for us. And Mark has always really, really trusted people, so that a lot of the vision and growth of the institution are the people who run it. It's not Mark, it's those people. It was Enrico, and then it was Eve Sussman, it was Kathleen Gilrain, who does Macmillan now. It was Allison Baker, and now John Hatfield, and it was the education directors. I mean, all the people that they've had working for Socrates have been spectacular. And also it really attracts a very specific type of person because it has such a huge social program already. It is so connected to the neighborhood, so that the people who work there really, really believe in the mission, and we've been very lucky trusting them. So for that institution, it's just trying to do everything we can to make sure that it will be able to continue going forward. And then there's also Mark's legacy, and Mark is not, Mark is an artist. Mark does not like to think in a sort of planned out fashion. It's not how he worked, it's not how he started Socrates. Socrates started because he thought it was a great idea, let's make this happen. It was a crazy idea. So to, think about what is he doing with his catalog resume, these are all things he does not want to think about at all. At all. He basically thwarted us constantly over the years about anyone who's ever trying to do work on it, because he just is not interested in it, because he wants to make art. So a big challenge now is trying to figure out how to be strategic about going forward with his legacy, which is just not a topic that's of great interest to him. And it's, for me, an area where there is a huge amount of work to be done, because even though Mark is very, very well known, obviously, there has been almost no scholarship on him. The last museum show, real significant museum show that had an indoor component, was 1974 at the Whitney. Obviously, SF MoMA did a big outdoor show, but that was a different type of show. So the Whitney show in New York was the last time he ever had a museum exhibition in this country. He's an artist that a lot of people don't, he's viewed in a very, very particular way. And I think that that's a big, not hurdle, that's just a big element of him that has to be grappled with going forward. And we've been very lucky with a lot of people who are very concerned about him, who care about him deeply, between collectors and people like Paula Cooper, who really, really care about that legacy going forward and how that's going to be dealt with and work now toward it. And we're working for that because I think it's an area that really has to be addressed for him.
You've each sort of touched on something which leads me to want to pinpoint it a little bit. It has to do with your lives every day. The degree to which you try to channel the name on the door and that person's thoughts and wishes and so forth, and the degree to which you try to put such a thought aside because 3 out of 4 cases the person isn't around. So how would you respond to that?
It's something I spent a lot of time thinking about actually, initially, and especially going into the role, coming back and going into the role of director and feeling like we needed to pause and we had a board that none of our board members know Mitchell. So this is where we are different and unique. It was a board not of people comprised of friends and family. So recognizing that we're not gonna invent something, but sort of what do we ground ourselves in terms of that. And for me, that it felt really essential to understand that and grounding it both in the work in terms of stewardship, but also talking to as many people as possible who knew her, those types of things in terms of understanding. But then at a certain point recognizing it's 25 years out, we have built a reputation as a foundation that is doing a certain type of work. We can't sort of reinvent Mitchell and make a little shrine for her. We have to think about sort of what are the core values. And so we had a lot of conversations internally about core values that we understood from what people said about her, from the reading, from our research about her, and then also thinking about what are our core values already with our history as an organization. And for us, this is where really returning to thinking about being artist-centered. And so as I mentioned, in 2015, we made some decisions around our operating size, and part of those decisions were really around focusing in on this idea. For us, we thought of it as being from Mitchell for artists and how to hone in on that. And historically, we had done a range of other types of programs, and so we really streamlined towards thinking about our grants for artists that we do, the residency program, thinking about really being able to for artists to know that the generosity they're receiving is coming from another artist.
We're in a similar situation, and when you're dealing with someone's legacy, especially someone in my case who was a very close friend, you try to think at first, well, what would he do if he were alive? But then you think, well, that's a stupid way of looking at it. Because what you're really asking yourself is, what is the right thing to do in relation to the core values and beliefs of both him and you and your team? And that makes things a lot easier, because for one thing, things changed an enormous amount since Mother died. And so in a certain way, a smarter question, if you wanted to ask that question, would be, well, knowing that everything has changed, what kinds of things would he be interested in now, given his values? And that's something we try to do with our programs. We try to do them in a way that is in keeping generally with his interests. And he had pretty broad interests, so that, for example, in our senior fellowship program, we have go to our website and see we have a lot of fellowship programs and scholarship programs, etc. So in our senior fellowship program, we give senior fellowships to filmmakers, We've given senior fellowships to people who've written about poetry. So, we're not just dealing with visual art, even though our emphasis is on visual art, because these were all great interests of Motherwell's, and they're also great interests of me and my board members. And my board is a relatively small board right now, 5 people, and they're all art people. So that there's a kind of understanding about, what's important, what are the values that are important.
I have so many options. So I think I heard Jack say I should throw out my Ouija board. Well, let's see. Adolf was interested in a community of artists. He felt he was one of a community of artists. He had that feeling from the very beginning. He was very much a leader, and I think very much ahead of his time in thinking of himself as a professional among a group of professionals, and represented himself that way. So that colors a lot of what we do, taking that approach and really thinking of this community of artists that still exists, but it's a different community now, and a lot of changes have happened, obviously. I had the advantage, as far as the question you asked, I had the advantage of working with Esther Gottlieb for 12 years and saw her virtually every day for 12 years and got an amazing grounding on what values she and her husband had. And I'll remind everyone that we are the Adolf and Esther Gottlieb Foundation. And her views and her values were close to her husband's, but both the values of both of those people are involved in what we do. You have to remain open. We have to remain open to what the current community of artists is, and that's so vast now and so large, so much larger than what used to exist. I started 43 years ago. At the time, I knew practically every artist in New York, and certainly knew all of the museum people and all the curators. Now I know a very tiny percentage. So trying to keep on top of that is a challenge, but trying to keep it, I guess, in the perspective of a community of artists primarily. That's our focus primarily.
Luckily, since all of Mark's foundations have been created while he's alive, everyone involved has a good idea of what Mark would like. But one of the great things about Mark is that Mark trusts other people. So Mark can be a terrible micromanager about things about his own sculpture, but otherwise he really trusts people to do the things that they do best. And he trusts people to have ideas, and he listens to what they have to say and what they think is the right thing to do. And he does that in a lot of different areas, so that which allows us planning, working with the different organizations to try to come up with solutions that we hope are the best solutions for those organizations. And so it allows us going forward, I think, to know that, to trust ourselves and trust the people that they'll be able to work out what the right thing is going forward into the future. One of the things about Mark is the other people have said about their own artists is artists are often very interested in other art forms. Mark is very passionately involved with poetry. If you've ever seen his catalogs usually have poetry in it because he feels that creates dimension to looking at photographs. He's trying to get an emotional content. He is a great, great lover of music. He supports music. He supports an opera company. He has a huge range of interests that also allow his organizations to have a lot of flexibility about what they can do in the future that is in the spirit of him. He's also passionately involved in science. He is obsessive about prime numbers. Don't ask me why. So, but Mark finds prime numbers incredibly interesting. So in any event, we have a broad range of interests that anything that he does could go forward with, which is very exciting.
So here's kind of the opposite question. I just asked you how you channel the name on the door. What advice would you give to living artists who are thinking about forming a foundation? What good advice would you give them?
A disclaimer first, which is that what I'm going to say has no resemblance at all to any person living or dead. I would advise an artist not to have their foundation run by a studio system, preferably not to have family members too deeply involved. Those are the first two things I would tell the artist.
I didn't. No, I think it is, from my vantage, it's be specific but leave space at the same time. Because when you get too specific, everybody's gonna get too caught in that. But be specific about certain key parts in terms of like what you see the next few years, but then leave space for it. Because I think that's also where, as Jack is saying, I think the complexities that we all can see unfolding in artist-endowed foundations are when the group of people around get more and more specific, and it can get tighter in a certain way.
I might not go over it, but I would. In my experience, the way I like to think about artist-endowed foundations is that they should reflect the spirit of the artist, and every artist is very different from every other artist. So the first thing I would advise someone is think about what you might like to happen. What would you like your foundation to do? Because foundations can do virtually anything. They really can. It's a legal mechanism to find a way to spend money. So use that same imagination that you use, but think about what would you like to see going forward? How would you like your legacy to project after you're no longer around? That's the advice I would give.
I feel like absolute advice would be not everything has to last forever. I think that sometimes things can be very limited, and that's fine. You know, that foundations don't have to go on forever. They don't have to be, they can sunset, things can get solved. I don't know that all artists need to have foundations. I think artists really, really grapple with what to do with their work. And, you know, we have been talking about people who are very prominent, but I know so many artists who have a body of work, they're not well known, and the problem is what to do with it, how to take care of it. And it's a huge problem, and I don't know that a foundation is necessarily the best solution for that. So I don't know what is, but
I would just reiterate that in terms of, I think there's a component of recognizing artist-endowed foundations isn't just about dealing with the work and ensuring people think about the opportunity to be generous and the impact, which I think both of you were talking about. Keeping that as a central part. I sometimes feel like people get stuck when I hear in some of the gatherings, people get stuck on the work, which is a significant part of it, but also thinking about what's the impact you want in the bigger sense.
My next question, which only sort of is about a subject that I didn't even know existed, but I have a friend who wrote a book about it and feels very passionate about it. Self-published book. This friend says, and now I saw an editorial recently in the Times, that all these foundations are nothing more than rich people's toys, and it's another scam, it's another ripoff. And of course, we're all here in the art world, you know, and you're talking about such great deeds, but have you heard this? Has this come up in your life?
It is a tax, it's a tax, that's why it's set up, is to deal with tax. Yes, I've heard it, but I feel like for us, obviously, at the Joan Mitchell Foundation, I feel really solidly about, and I see this around the table too, about the charitable purposes. Like, we have funded over 1,000 artists directly. We have worked with thousands more. We have an artist in residence program in New Orleans that is doing immense work within New Orleans, as well as connecting national artists throughout with each other. And to me, if it is a tax avoidance strategy, it has some incredible benefits for the public, and especially in the US, where we don't have a state system of supporting the arts. This is sort of the monster that was born in some manner. And I feel really strongly that our community of artist-endowed foundations is doing spectacular work.
Yeah, I've never heard the accusation directly, but yes, it's out there. And I feel that the work that we do, and I say we, not only the Dedalus Foundation, but the artist foundations that I'm familiar with do, is really legitimate public charity. And as Christa says, because in this country, the government doesn't do a lot for promoting American culture, I think even the legacy part of what we do, that is to say the promotion and the caretaking of the artist's work, is a very important thing, because this is not something that the government does, and this is an important part of American culture that the government doesn't even recognize as an important part of American culture. So I think what we're doing is not only not kind of a rip-off and a scam and a tax dodge, but I think it's really very important in terms of the culture as a whole.
Just so we change the word.
When I saw that question first, it just made me laugh, because most artists I know don't have any money. So this notion that it's a rich person's scam is like, who are they talking about? And also a successful artist is not necessarily a rich artist. So, a lot of times, these other people on this panel are experts in this field, and I learn from them all the time and studying all these foundations that exist. But my sense is that a lot of times artists also, when they die, they may have a body of work, but they don't have money. And it's not that suddenly there's this pile of money that's being distributed. It's a very, very complicated situation where a collection is, someone's trying to monetize it to allow the foundation to survive for any amount of time while things can be sorted out. It's very, very complicated. And a lot of people who are very skilled have worked out how to try to make the organization survive in those early years can be quite hard for organizations.
Yeah, and I'd like to, if I may, for a second, when Motherwell died, he's pretty well off, but he didn't leave the foundation any money at all whatsoever. And the first act that we did was to take out a line of credit at a bank so we could pay bills for rent on the place that we rented originally up in Westchester. He gave us a lot of art. And then the question was, how do we distribute this art in a way that's meaningful, place it in where we think the best place to be, and monetize it to some degree. When I say to some degree, we started out basically doing a gift purchase deal with museums, where the museums were paying a very small fraction of the fair market value of the work. And that's how we got going. So it was the opposite of protecting a lot of money by tax sheltering it. I think that there are foundations in other domains. One of them was run, as we all know, by a very prominent person, unfortunately, in our country, that are rip-off things. You know what I'm talking about? It's a blatant rip-off. And they're not even subtle.
I think I'm modeling my foundation on one organized by a prominent politician. I don't think I'm gonna do that. Similar to what Jack was just saying, when Gottlieb was successful in his lifetime, probably more successful than a number of his peers, but that didn't mean he had a lot of money, because things didn't sell for a lot of money. And he was living his life and doing other things. So when we started, my answer just to that question, when we started, we had no cash. We had committed to starting a grant program. So we borrowed $10,000, set up a grant program, made 4 grants of $2,500 each. The value of what we inherited, which was a loft on West Broadway and Broome Street, part of a house in East Hampton and a collection of art. The total value at the time was just over $1 million. We have to date distributed more than $20 million to individual artists around the world, and we'll continue to do that for a very long time. So I don't know what we missed in
So on the subject of money, this will be my last question. Each of you, in one way or another, has an arrangement with a gallery. Can you describe the benefits and difficulties in working with galleries and how it advances the cause and how it is difficult?
I don't mind starting this one because we don't work with a gallery. We don't have a single gallery. This is something that Motherwell, he said he'd prefer if we didn't have a single gallery. He didn't think, and he was very flexible. You know, there were things he preferred, but you know, he understood that we might have to do one or two things differently. But we didn't have a gallery at the beginning, and we ended up we still don't have a gallery. We've been working with several galleries, some in Europe, some here in the United States. We recently had a couple of very, very beautiful shows that Paul Kasman did, and it's been very nice working with him as our New York gallery, but we also have galleries outside of New York in the United States as well as in Europe that we work with. So basically, you know, the galleries are a source of income. That's how part of how we fund our programs. The other part is through investments. And I found that by not having a gallery, it's given us a certain amount of freedom, because nobody, for example, wanted to sponsor our catalog raisonné. Nobody's pressuring us in the ways that galleries often do. And I know from colleagues that it can be a source of real pressure. The gallery has its agenda, and you have your agenda. So we're kind of happy not having a single gallery.
So we work obviously with one gallery. Right now we're with David Sperner Gallery. And for us, the decision was, I feel like the awareness for Mitchell has been growing phenomenally in the last few years, which is wonderful. It's exciting. We also, similar to Jack, part of our economic model is sales as well as our investment portfolio. So we knew we needed to have a partnership. And it was just a decision on a host of factors in terms of, we've always worked solely with one gallery, and it was a decision to continue working with one gallery, recognizing that Mitchell's sort of on the cusp of another level of recognition, if that makes sense. I think inherently, it's funny because Mark and I had a conversation about this, inherently, there's this question of like, what's the foundation's role within market and those sorts of things. So to be really clear, like, we're a foundation, and our role is not to control the market. And this is where, from our vantage of partnership right now, recognizing where Mitchell is in terms of this sort of shift within her market, it felt really important to have a strong partner to help understand and ensure that that market is stable. It's not our job to do that. So that's some of our thinking.
This one's a little easier for me. I guess I'll start by thinking about my oldest friend, Linda Benglis, who is also a board member of the Gottlieb Foundation. And Linda always says about dealer-artist relationships that they are like marriages. And she's quite right in that. It's a reciprocal relationship. It has to be a reciprocal relationship or it does not work. So we've worked with a number of different galleries, both here in New York, outside New York, and overseas. Right now, for the last 18 years, we've been showing with Pace in New York, which has been very good for us, and I hope for them as well. And it's been a reciprocal relationship. They understand what our concerns are, and they work pretty hard to work with us, not against us, and not to pressure us to say, sell this, sell that, sell the other. And I'll plug, we have a show coming, actually a very big show coming up with them that opens March 1st. So I'll ask you to go out and see that as well. We've worked with galleries in Madrid, in London, in Munich, in Berlin, all pretty much on the same basis. Those were tended to be shorter term relationships, and I think mostly because the distances were so great that we didn't have the day-to-day or week-to-week involvement that we can with someone who's based here.
Well, obviously Mark's situation is a little different because he's alive and has an ongoing relationship. He's had probably the most important career relationships for him were with dealers. It was with Richard Bellamy and with Paula Cooper. So those people were essential to him throughout his creative life. He worked with both of them on and off from the early 60s. And they're the people, I think, for whom he wanted them to look at his work. Dick Bellamy was, at the end of his life, his office was at Mark's studio. And so he was there on a daily basis with Mark. And I think certainly in certain years, Dick was the person for whom Mark made art. Or it was the person to see it, that view, it was just essential. And I think Paula also, Paula, they're temperamentally very different people. Obviously, Dick was crazy like Mark was crazy, but in a different way. I think Paula, he relies on for, I think in a lot of ways, sanity. She is, so professional, so understanding the market. He so respects everything that she does. And he really relies on that because he's very outside. He doesn't like getting that involved. He's very in his own space. He's not, I would say Mark is not mainstream, but in the sense that he's always been in his backwater of Queens. He stays out of things in many ways. He didn't socialize very much. So those relationships were key to his sort of development as an artist. So we have extremely, he's worked with other dealers, those two dealers and those two galleries, and also Steve's here. All these things have been essential to Mark, very, very important. So it's hard to say in the future what that will be, because that'll be, down the road, but I would say, that is just key for him.
I think it's clear that each foundation is its own entity, and each person who runs it takes these responsibilities very seriously. So does anybody have any questions for any of these people? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. First, I guess I just want to thank you all for this wonderful conversation. Sanford, my question is for you. I'm curious about, you talked about catastrophic emergencies as part of the Foundation's two main programs. How did that factor into the Gottlieb's core values as you talked about them? And could you give us one story of what that looks like for you and your board?
Yeah, Adolf and Esther were always known among their friends as people who could be turned to when somebody needed help. And I'll give you two stories quickly about them. One from Esther's memorial service, and Adolf died obviously earlier. I knew a fellow who had been a friend of the Gottlieb's from the time Adolf was his summer camp arts and crafts counselor, which was 1916. Wonderful man. He was an artist, and he was not commercially successful, but he was serious about what he did and was involved with a lot of the people of Gottlieb's generation. At any rate, he came up to me at Esther's memorial service, and he was totally in tears. He was sobbing and said to me, All my life, I knew if I ever had a problem, if things weren't going right, I could turn to Adolf or Esther, and now they're both gone. And I was lucky enough to be able to say to him, yes, but the Gottlieb Foundation is still here. So that's one. The other story is one that Richard Archwager told me, and I hadn't heard it till he told me. He said one day, when he was younger, he was having trouble paying his rent, not unusual among the community of artists, and didn't know how he was going to get through. His landlord had been harassing him. He said the phone rang. He picked it up, and it was this person introduced himself as a lawyer and said, "I understand that you're having trouble with your landlord. Can I help?" And Dick said, "Well, I don't have money to pay a lawyer. I don't have money to pay my rent. But how did you find out about this?" He says, "Well, Adolf Gottlieb told me that he had heard that you were having trouble, and he asked me to give you a call and see how I could help you." Now, I have to say, Dick Archwager and Adolf Gottlieb didn't know each other at that time. So the other part of your question was how do we deal with that? We had the application process is an open application process that is literally worldwide. We try to be receptive to what people tell us. We specifically deal with catastrophic emergencies. So fire, flood, emergency medical, some combination of events that really is out of the ordinary and really places an immediate and very harsh burden on the individual. We've been able to help all kinds of people in all kinds of situations. I think one of the ones that stands out fairly recently, we heard from a fellow who was native of Rwanda, but had been chased out of Rwanda by rebels and was living at the time he got in touch with us in a refugee camp in an airport in the Republic of Congo. We managed, it was tough, but we managed to find out what his situation was, what his needs were, how we could communicate with him, and ultimately made a grant to him. And I will tell you that there are no banks or anything resembling banks in an airport in the Republic of Congo. So we try to find ways to get this done.
Other questions? All the way in the back.
Why do the government not get money for art or like programs for it?
A little
Why does the
louder,
government
a little
not give
louder.
money to art programs?
I think the question is, why doesn't the government give more money to programs for individual artists? Wasn't that the question? I don't know the answer to that one either. They used to, through the National Endowment for the Arts, there used to be individual artist funding that ended in 1992. Unfortunately, and I was involved in lobbying on that, so I do know a little about it. I think in this cultural war that we've been in for, it seems like forever, artists were an easy target. Because we all know, and it's also part of the history of the Gottlieb Foundation. When we started to set up the foundation, there were no foundations making grants to individual artists. That didn't exist. And I spent a lot of time explaining to people whose assumption was, artists? You give them money, they're going to buy drugs. If they make art with the drugs, will that work? The purpose was to make art, but it's a tough sell for the government, for any government. I have to say, states give a lot of funding both to individuals and to organizations and to institutions. The federal government does give some help to bigger institutions. And if you want to see more help go to individual artists, write your member of Congress. Go visit them. Pound their door and yell at them.
Other questions?
So as investors in the capital markets, how do you think about reflecting the core values of your founding artist or your broader board?
Well, we have, in the last year or two, become especially conscious of that, and we're working with the bank through whom we invest to focus our investments toward socially responsible investing. And I have to say, this is something that only in the last couple of years that we've become conscious of. And I think it's because only in the last couple of years we've become aware of the fact that it could be done while still performing the fiduciary role toward the foundation. Because as fiduciary of a corporation, you have a role to act in the best financial interest of the corporation, best interest, including financial. And so it had seemed that it would be difficult if you were not making certain kinds of investments to maximize. But one of the things that's happened also in the financial services industry, they've become much more aware of kind of green investments, if you want to put it that way. So.
We also have been doing socially responsible investment screening and defining what our specific focus is on that over the last few years. And it has prompted a conversation on our board about who we sell the paintings to too, which is a completely different, very complicated conversation around how you can or can't control that, so.
Yeah, I'm just curious, sort of a loaded question, but how do you deal with self-dealing in terms of your fiduciary responsibilities?
Well, I think probably we all do it in a similar way. I think the way we do it is that nobody on our board can buy or sell a Motherwell. And in fact, a few years ago, an early Motherwell came up at auction, and it had a really low estimate because it was an early painting. And there was a moment where I thought, gee, wouldn't it be great to bid on it? And there's no way personally. And now in terms of the foundation, we generally don't buy Motherwell's work, but we could, that would not be self-dealing, because basically we would be, and actually we did that once. It was a work came up at auction which was damaged, and we bought it at a very good price. We had it fixed, and we sold it at a very big discount less than we paid for it, along with another work to a major museum. So I don't think self-dealing is a big problem in this domain, because most people are aware of the fact that you really have to have a wall between the various aspects of the foundation.
Yeah, and for us, there are no family members, similar thing.
Other questions?
Oh, hi. So when I first came to New York, one of the books, many books, one of the many books that I read was Dory Aston, New York School Cultural Reckoning. And I still remember in her author's note, my favorite philosopher is Gaston Bachelard. I like particularly his boundless contempt for those, like psychoanalysts, trying to explain the flower by the fertilizer. In other words, knowing the artistic ambience doesn't quite explain his work. And yet, in the book, in the second chapter, it's called Hair is Not Just Painted. So it painted this picture of the community, of the artists. I mean, I learned so much about the abstract expressionists, the term that many participant members would disagree, or action painting, you wouldn't describe that to Rothko or Newman. And so my point was that within that community, there arose this amazing distinctive artists, from Pollock to de Kooning to Motherwell. It's so Gottlieb and all the many others. So my question is simple: how do you mediate between the inner, internal self of the artist, and then the artist who explicate the person that is part of the community that cultivate him or her. This is something that the Kunin was so brilliant at. One point he said, for milk to become yogurt, it needs culture. So there's two-part question, the community and what you do in the studio. How would you mediate between the two activities? And from your perspective, since you are so deeply involved with each of the Artist Foundation, knowing them all, so I just trying to figure it out from the perspective of someone who don't know enough about the Artist Foundation. So thank you again. I know it's long-winded question, but please.
What was the question? I'm not quite sure what the question is. Actually.
Similar way what I asked, channeling. The initial channeling the moments in the past when the artist was in the studio to now. Is that what you're saying?
Okay, that sounds good.
I'm channeling you. Not too well.
Well, you know what I did more. The point is,
This lady.
I'm curious about the beginnings of the foundations, the setting up period, and coming into, I mean, it sounds like a number of you had history or have history with the artists themselves. But particularly that dynamic between of like nothing to something, which I also wonder about in the case where an artist does have various degrees of reputation, a small reputation, which can be bigger. I mean, I'm thinking about what's happening in Calder, et cetera. I mean, he was big, always, but I mean, yeah, that's what I'm asking.
In a way, this is something that we talked about, the birth pang. The birth pang of the Mitchell Foundation.
Yeah, no. So for us, when Mitchell died, the foundation was established actually by her attorney, John Summers, who was the father of my predecessor, Carolyn Summers. And the foundation took, the estate took about 10 years to be settled. And so during that time period, it was literally one person's big, did not have a collection, didn't have the archives, it was really doing the granting work. And this is what I refer, when I started at the foundation, the estate had settled in 2004, and we had received the collection, we were able to start actively loaning that work, also selling that work, and sort of growing. And similar to what everybody else mentioned, we started with very, very minimal money and substantial collection. And so there was, the way I think of it is we've had these sort of like different phases in terms of there was this extended long settlement phase that was very quiet and dormant in certain ways. And then from 2004 to 2014, there was a rapid growth and rapid growth in programs in particular within that. And now we're sort of in a phase where we're balancing in a different way.
Can I specify one more
please.
aspect is the artists in preparation for the foundation and the collection of their own work? Like, was it a conscious saving over years? Is it something they were buying back things?
Oh, she signed her will to wills 2 weeks before she died.
In an awful lot of situations, an artist dies and there's simply an estate.
So, and what I will also say is Mitchell, so she signed her will 2 weeks before she died. She had been having numerous conversations and had other wills where she talked about this idea of sort of what could she do? But frankly, the model of an artist-endowed foundation was not something she was really aware of. So I think she was literally, her attorney was literally saying to her, hey, you have to think about this. You don't have any children. where do you want this art to go? How do you want it to be structured? And one of her studio assistants, a close friend of hers, remembers her saying like, what should I do? Should I give it to the like, she loved dogs, should I give it to the like local dog pound? Like literally, it was like, I don't know, what is this gonna be for? And the studio assistant, it's sort of the wrong word, but a close friend of hers described saying to her like, Joan, you always support other artists. Just set it up to support other artists. Think about it like that. See what happens was sort of the advantage of it.
But the whole field of artist-endowed foundations is really relatively new as a field.
Yeah, in fact, the name Artist-Endowed Foundations is basically invented by Christine Vincent. And before we referred roughly to artist foundations, well, we found out that there were others. Because, I mean, Muswell didn't think he was starting an artist-endowed foundation. He wanted a vehicle that would preserve and take care of his work. I mean, that was basically the first thing, and that's why we got no money, we just got the work. And he also wanted certain things to be done. He was very explicit. He wanted to catalog Resnais. He did not want to support other artists directly because he felt that Gottlieb and Paula Krasner were already doing that. And so he thought he'd like to support scholarship. And our programs eventually grew out of these things. So we have a senior fellowship that we give to scholars who are fairly far along. We have PhD dissertation fellowships. One thing we did that kind of went a little bit against the grain is something that I wanted to do that I thought he would have wanted to do if he were still alive and I could persuade him was to start an MFA fellowship. Because even though he did not want to give fellowships to living artists, he was really very fixed on art education. It's something he really was passionate about. And so we felt that we were not going against his explicit wishes by starting a program of MFA fellowship some years ago.
And you didn't bring it up, Sandy, but a very admirable aspect of the Gottlieb Foundation is the grants given for help with artists who are mature artists who haven't received great attention. So I assume that goes for catalogs, for things like that. And you're unique in that way, I believe.
Well,
Spelling it out that way.
it was, it was Adolf Gottlieb and Mark Rothko, who were old friends, who sometime in the late 1960s, in conversation with one another, decided that both of them would leave legacies that would be worth some money. They didn't think about it before then because they didn't have anything before then. And they came up with the idea of establishing foundations that could help older artists, specifically older artists. Mark's unfortunately didn't come to pass. Ours did, but we had a specific charge, the language in the will is to provide grants in aid to mature creative painters and sculptors. The notion of unrecognized, now that's not part of our mission, but what we try to do is make our grants accessible to literally everyone. So it's not a matter of saying they will only go to people who haven't gotten some recognition. Anyone at all will have an equal opportunity to receive one of our grants. And I'm losing my way here, but.
Well, I just wanted to have you elaborate on that, the older artists.
Yeah, so what we're looking at for our annual grant is people who have been creating mature art for at least 20 years.
You could give a grant to Mark Suvero.
We could, but Mark Suvero could also give a grant to us, which we would then distribute more broadly.
Thank you all for coming.
Focusing on the process.